What happens when a government decides that your rights are negotiable? When they shut down your business, control your local meetings, make their agents immune from prosecution, and force armed soldiers into your home? Sounds like a dystopian nightmare, right? Well, this actually happened in America in 1774, and it's the reason we have a constitution today. This is the story of how Britain's attempt to crush colonial resistance accidentally created the United States of America. Welcome to Liberty Unfolded, where we explore the moments that shaped human liberty, and today we're traveling back to 1774, to one of the most pivotal moments in the fight for freedom, a moment when an empire's cruelty accidentally forged the world's greatest democracy. Year is 1774. The British Empire spans the globe, and King George Roman III sits on the throne of the most powerful nation on earth. 3,000 miles away in the American colonies, trouble is brewing. The Boston Tea Party has happened. British tea worth over $1 million in today's money lies at the bottom of Boston Harbor, and Parliament is furious. Their response will be swift, calculated, and devastating. 4 laws that the colonists will call intolerable laws, designed to crush the spirit of American resistance once and for all. But here's what the British didn't count on: sometimes when you push free people too far, they don't break, they unite. This is the story of how Britain's harshest punishment became America's greatest gift. This is the story of the Intolerable Acts of 1774, and how tyranny accidentally created the freest nation in human history. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's dive into a story that every lover of liberty needs to know, because the lessons of 1774 are more relevant today than ever before. It's March 31st, 1774, and Samuel Adams stands at the edge of Boston Harbor, watching the last merchant ship disappear beyond the horizon. The bustling port that once teemed with hundreds of vessels now lies eerily silent, its wooden piers stretching into empty water like the skeletal fingers of a dying giant. This wasn't the result of war or natural disaster. This was punishment, calculated and cold. Just months earlier, this same harbor had witnessed one of the most audacious acts of rebellion in colonial history. On December 16, 1773, roughly 150 colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians had boarded 3 British ships and dumped 342 chests of precious East India Company tea into these very waters. The tea, worth roughly $7 million in today's money, had dissolved into the harbor like sugar in a cup, turning the dark waters into what some called Boston tea. But King George Roman III and Parliament weren't laughing. King George Roman III charged the colonists with attempting to injure British commerce and subvert the Constitution, and their response would be swift and merciless. The Boston Port Act, passed on March 31st, 1774, was Britain's nuclear option economic warfare designed to bring America's most defiant city to its knees. The Boston Port Act was the first and most devastating blow, closing Boston's harbor completely until colonists paid for the destroyed tea. Imagine waking up one morning to find that your city's lifeline had been severed. Boston wasn't just any port, it was the beating heart of colonial commerce, the gateway through which flowed the lifeblood of New England's economy. Fish, lumber, rum, and countless other goods that sustained not just Boston, but entire regions of America, suddenly had nowhere to go. The human cost was immediate and devastating. Thousands of dock workers, sailors, merchants, and shopkeepers found themselves unemployed overnight. Families who had lived for generations on the harbor's bounty now faced starvation. The once proud merchant ships that had made Boston wealthy now sat rotting at anchor in nearby ports, their captains forbidden from entering Boston's waters under penalty of confiscation. But perhaps most infuriating was the condition for reopening the port. The British demanded not just compensation for the tea, but payment for the customs duties that would have been collected on it. plus damages to the East India Company. They wanted the colonists to essentially pay a ransom for their own freedom, and to do so while admitting guilt for what many considered a justified act of resistance. The psychological warfare was as calculated as the economic punishment. British warships patrolled the harbor entrance like sharks, their cannons trained on any vessel that dared approach. The message was clear: defy the crown, and we will destroy not just you, but everyone who depends on you. Your rebellion will be the cause of your neighbors' suffering, yet even as Boston's economy withered, something unexpected began to happen. Other colonies, rather than abandoning their troublesome neighbor, began to rally to its aid. Wagons loaded with grain rolled in from Pennsylvania. Rice arrived from South Carolina. Connecticut sent sheep and cattle. The British had intended to isolate Boston, but instead they had created the first true moment of intercolonial solidarity in American history. The Boston Port Act revealed the true nature of British imperial control. It wasn't just about tea or taxes. It was about absolute obedience. The Crown was willing to starve an entire city to make a point, to use collective punishment against civilians to crush the spirit of resistance. In doing so, they had crossed a line that many colonists found unforgivable. As Samuel Adams stood on that silent wharf, watching the sunset paint the empty harbor red, he could not have known that Britain's harshest punishment would become America's greatest gift, the gift of unity born from shared suffering and common cause. In the flickering candlelight of Faneuil Hall on the evening of May 20th, 1774, John Hancock rose to address what would be the last freely elected town meeting in Massachusetts for years to come. The hall, which had witnessed countless debates about colonial rights and resistance, was packed with citizens who sensed that something fundamental was ending. They were right. Earlier that day, news had arrived from London that would shatter the very foundation of Massachusetts governance. The Massachusetts Government Act, passed by Parliament on May 20th, 1774, wasn't just another punitive law, it was the death certificate of colonial democracy. With the stroke of a pen, Britain had erased 150 years of self-governance and replaced it with military rule. The acts took away self-governance and rights that Massachusetts had enjoyed since its founding, transforming a free colony into what amounted to an occupied territory. To understand the magnitude of this change, imagine if the federal government suddenly declared that your state constitution was null and void, that your elected governor was fired, and that federal troops would now run your local government. This is exactly what Britain did to Massachusetts. The Massachusetts Charter of 1690, had been the colony's sacred document, its constitutional foundation that guaranteed certain rights and freedoms. Under this charter, Massachusetts had developed a vibrant democratic culture. Town meetings were the heartbeat of local governance, spirited gatherings where ordinary citizens debated everything from road repairs to revolutionary resistance. The colonial legislature, elected by the people, had real power to pass laws and control the purse strings. All of this vanished overnight. The Massachusetts Government Act revoked the charter and imposed a new system of government that was breathtakingly authoritarian. The governor would now be appointed directly by the king, not elected by the colonial legislature. The governor's council, which had served as a check on executive power, would also be royally appointed rather than democratically chosen. But perhaps most devastating was the assault on town meetings, the very foundation of New England democracy. These gatherings, which had been called whenever citizens felt the need to address community issues, were now forbidden without the governor's explicit permission. And when they were allowed, they could only discuss items approved by the royal government. Imagine being told that you and your neighbors could no longer meet to discuss local problems unless you first got permission from a government official who lived 3,000 miles away. The transformation was immediate and jarring. General Thomas Gage, the military commander who became the new royal governor, arrived in Boston with clear instructions, crushed the spirit of colonial self-governance. He moved quickly to reshape the political landscape, appointing loyalists to key positions and surrounding himself with British military officers rather than colonial representatives. The psychological impact was perhaps even more devastating than the political changes. For generations, Massachusetts colonists had taken pride in their ability to govern themselves. They had built schools, roads, and communities through democratic deliberation. They had faced down hostile Native American tribes, harsh winters, and economic hardships by working together as free citizens. Now, suddenly, they were subjects again, not citizens, but subjects of a distant king who clearly viewed them as unfit for self-rule. The irony was bitter. Massachusetts had been founded by Puritans seeking religious and political freedom from an oppressive English government. Now, 150 years later, their descendants found themselves under the boot of that same government, their hard-won freedoms stripped away as punishment for daring to resist. Local leaders found themselves in an impossible position. Men like Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who had built their careers in the colonial legislature, suddenly found their positions meaningless. The institutions through which they had served their communities were either abolished or rendered powerless. They faced a choice: submit to the new order and become complicit in the destruction of their own democratic traditions, or resist and face the full force of British military power. The Massachusetts Government Act revealed the true nature of the imperial relationship. Britain had never seen the colonies as junior partners in a shared enterprise, but as possessions to be managed. When those possessions became troublesome, the solution was simple: strip away their rights and rule them directly. Democracy, in the British view, was a privilege that could be revoked at will, not a right inherent to free people. As that final town meeting in Faneuil Hall drew to a close, the participants knew they were witnessing the end of an era. The candles flickered lower, casting long shadows on the walls where portraits of colonial leaders gazed down at their successors. These men and women were no longer citizens of a self-governing colony. They were subjects of an empire that had just demonstrated it would crush their most cherished freedoms to maintain control. The courthouse in Worcester, Massachusetts, had always been a symbol of colonial justice, a place where ordinary citizens could seek redress against wrongdoing, where British soldiers and royal officials faced the same laws as everyone else. But on September 2nd, 1774, as crowds of angry colonists surrounded the building and prevented the royal court from convening, it became something else entirely, a symbol of resistance against what they called the Murder Act. The Administration of Justice Act, passed by Parliament in May 1774, represented perhaps the most cynical of Britain's punitive measures. The Administration of Justice Act offered protection to royal officials in Massachusetts, allowing them to transfer to England all court cases against them involving riot suppression or revenue collection. In simple terms, British soldiers and officials could now kill Americans with virtual impunity, knowing that any trial would take place 3,000 miles away, where colonial witnesses couldn't afford to travel and colonial juries couldn't reach them. The colonists immediately understood the implications, and it removed the ability of the colonists to hold trials of British officials in the colonies, earning it the nickname Murder Act. But to truly grasp why this law was so inflammatory, we need to understand the legal tradition it destroyed, and the fresh memories that made colonists fear the worst. Just 4 years earlier, on March 5th, 1770, British soldiers had fired into a crowd of Boston civilians, killing 5 people in what became known as the Boston Massacre. The incident had inflamed colonial opinion, But what happened next had been crucial in maintaining some semblance of justice and order. The soldiers were tried in colonial courts with colonial juries under colonial law. Remarkably, they received a fair trial defended by none other than John Adams, who believed that even British soldiers deserved justice under law. Most were acquitted, and those convicted received relatively light sentences. This trial had been a shining example of colonial justice at work. It proved that Americans could be fair and impartial, that they wouldn't lynch British soldiers in the streets, but would trust in the rule of law. It also demonstrated that colonial courts were perfectly capable of handling sensitive cases involving imperial officials. The Administration of Justice Act destroyed this entire framework. Now, when British soldiers fired into crowds or when customs officials brutalized colonists in the course of collecting taxes, there would be no local accountability. The victims' families wouldn't see justice done in their own communities. Witnesses wouldn't be able to testify. The very idea that British officials were subject to the same laws as colonists was abandoned. Consider the practical implications. If a British soldier killed your neighbor, your son, your father, the case would be transferred to London. Could you afford to travel to England to testify? Could your community scrape together the money to send witnesses across the Atlantic? Even if they could, would English juries who had never lived under military occupation, who didn't understand the daily tensions of colonial life, deliver justice for colonial victims? The psychological message was even more devastating than the practical obstacles. The British government was essentially declaring that colonial lives didn't matter enough to warrant local justice, that British officials were a superior class of people who couldn't be trusted to face colonial juries, that the very concept of equal justice under law, a cornerstone of English legal tradition, didn't apply in America. The colonists' response was swift and decisive. In county after county across Massachusetts, citizens organized to shut down the royal courts entirely. They understood that justice perverted was worse than no justice at all. In Worcester, 2,000 farmers and artisans surrounded the courthouse, forcing the judges to publicly renounce the Administration of Justice Act. In Springfield, Northampton, and dozens of other towns, similar scenes played out as ordinary citizens took control of their own legal systems. These weren't anarchists or radicals seeking to destroy law and order. These were conservative farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who believed deeply in the rule of law. But they also understood that law without justice was merely organized oppression. They had seen what happened in Ireland, where British officials routinely escaped accountability for their actions against Irish subjects. They weren't going to let America follow the same path. Perhaps most telling was the response of colonial lawyers and judges. Many of these men had spent years building their careers within the imperial legal system. They had studied English law, revered English legal traditions, and seen themselves as part of a great common law heritage stretching back centuries. Yet when faced with the Administration of Justice Act, many of them walked away from their positions rather than participate in what they saw as a perversion of justice. John Adams, who had defended British soldiers just 4 years earlier, now found himself helping to organize resistance against British legal authority. The irony was bitter. The same man who had proven colonial justice could be fair and impartial was now forced to conclude that British justice was neither. The Administration of Justice Act revealed the Empire's true priorities. When forced to choose between justice and control, between the rule of law and the protection of officials, Britain chose control every time. They were willing to sacrifice the very legal traditions that supposedly bound the Empire together in order to shield their representatives from accountability. As those Massachusetts farmers surrounded the Worcester courthouse, they weren't just protesting a single law. They were declaring that they would no longer accept a system where justice was a privilege of the powerful rather than a right of all citizens. In shutting down the royal courts, they were opening the door to revolution because a people who could no longer trust in justice would eventually be forced to seek it through other means. The knock on Susanna Carter's door came at dusk on a cold October evening in 1774. She was a widowed seamstress living in a modest two-room house in Boston's North End, barely making ends meet by taking in mending work from her neighbors. When she opened the door, she found herself face with a British sergeant and two soldiers, their red coats vivid against the growing darkness. "Ma'am," the sergeant said, consulting a piece of paper, "by order of His Majesty's government, you are required to quarter 2 soldiers in your home. They'll be staying indefinitely." Without waiting for her response, the soldiers pushed past her into her home, their boots tracking mud across the floor she had scrubbed that morning. One of them surveyed her small kitchen and pointed to her meager pantry. "What's for supper?" he asked with a grin that made her skin crawl. This scene, repeated in hundreds of colonial homes, was the human face of Britain's 4th Intolerable Act. The 4th Intolerable Act included new arrangements for housing British troops in occupied American dwellings, thus reviving the indignation that surrounded the earlier Quartering Act. But this wasn't just about providing housing for soldiers, it was about breaking the fundamental English principle that a man's home was his castle, beyond the reach of government intrusion. The concept of sanctuary within one's own home was sacred to English law and tradition. For centuries, English courts had ruled that not even the king could force entry into a private home without just cause and proper legal process. The famous jurist Sir Edward Coke had declared that a man's house is his castle, and this principle had been fiercely defended through generations of legal precedent. Yet here was Parliament, supposedly the guardian of English liberty, ordering colonial families to open their homes to foreign soldiers, men who owed no loyalty to the community, who answered to military rather than civilian authority, and who could not be held accountable by local courts thanks to the Administration of Justice Act. The practical implications were devastating and deeply personal. Colonial homes were not large by modern standards. Most families lived in 1 or 2 rooms, with multiple generations often sharing the same space. Privacy was already a luxury few could afford. Now, families like Susanna Carter's were forced to give up what little privacy they had to accommodate soldiers who might be hostile, drunk, or worse. Women bore the heaviest burden. In an age when a woman's reputation was her most valuable possession, being forced to share her home with unmarried soldiers was a form of social death sentence. Neighbors whispered, marriage prospects evaporated. The very presence of soldiers in a home suggested impropriety, regardless of the actual behavior of those involved. But the violations went far beyond social concerns. These soldiers were not guests, they were occupiers with legal authority to remain whether the family wanted them or not. They ate the family's food, used their firewood, occupied their beds, and contributed nothing to the household expenses. Many were young men far from home, with little respect for colonial customs or sensibilities. Children grew up in homes where foreign soldiers lounged by the fire, cleaned their weapons at the kitchen table, and told stories of battles fought against people who looked and sounded just like their parents. The psychological impact of military occupation on children was profound. They learned to whisper in their own homes, to avoid certain rooms, to fear the men in red coats who had invaded their most private spaces. The economic impact was equally severe. Colonial families operating on subsistence budgets suddenly found themselves feeding additional mouths with no additional income. Susanna Carter's situation was typical. A single woman struggling to survive was now required to provide food, shelter, and fuel for 2 grown men. When she protested that she couldn't afford to feed them, The sergeant merely shrugged and suggested she find a way. Some families were driven to desperate measures. They sold furniture to buy food, took on additional work at starvation wages, or borrowed money they couldn't repay. Others were forced to move out of their own homes, sleeping in barns or with relatives, because the soldiers had claimed the best rooms and showed no inclination to share. The religious implications were equally troubling. Many colonial families were deeply devout, beginning and ending each day with family prayers, maintaining strict Sabbath observances, and teaching their children moral behavior through example. Having soldiers' men who swore, drank, and told crude stories living in their homes made these religious practices difficult or impossible to maintain. Perhaps most infuriating was the legal helplessness of the situation. Colonial families had no recourse under law, no way to evict unwanted soldiers, no mechanism for seeking compensation for damages. If a soldier broke their furniture, seduced their daughter, or stole their possessions, there was nothing they could do. The very courts that might have provided justice were now controlled by the same imperial system that had quartered the soldiers in the first place. The Quartering Act transformed every colonial home into a potential battleground in the struggle between imperial authority and personal liberty. When Susanna Carter went to bed each night, she did so knowing that armed men loyal to a foreign king were sleeping under her roof, eating her food, and occupying her space by force of law. The psychological warfare was deliberate and effective. The British understood that nothing would break colonial resistance faster than turning their own homes into reminders of their subjugation. Every meal shared with unwelcome soldiers, every night spent sleeping under the same roof as occupying troops, every morning that began with the sight of red coats in the kitchen was a reminder that they were no longer free people in their own land. As autumn turned to winter in 1774, colonial families huddled around fires shared with British soldiers. Their children fell asleep to the sound of foreign voices in their own homes, and their most intimate family moments were observed by men who served a distant king. The Quartering Act had accomplished what no amount of taxation or trade regulation could achieve. It had brought the full weight of imperial oppression into the most private spaces of colonial life. The violation was complete, the message unmistakable. There was no sanctuary from British power, no retreat from imperial authority, no space too sacred for occupation. Your home was no longer your castle, it belonged to the crown, and the crown would use it as it saw fit. The letter arrived at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia on September 6, 1774, carried by a dust-covered rider who had pushed his horse hard through the late summer heat. As delegates to the First Continental Congress broke the wax seal and read the urgent words from Boston, a hush fell over the assembled representatives. The message was clear. British troops were seizing colonial gunpowder, fortifying Boston Neck, and preparing for what looked like all-out war against Massachusetts. But something remarkable happened in that moment of crisis. Instead of abandoning their troublesome northern neighbor, instead of seeking separate peace with Britain, delegates from 12 colonies rose as one to declare their solidarity with Massachusetts. The colonists labeled the new laws the Intolerable Acts, for they systematically abridged the liberties they held sacred and inviolable. In trying to isolate and punish one colony, Britain had instead created something that had never existed before, a truly united American resistance. The story of how Britain's harshest punishment became America's greatest gift is one of the most dramatic reversals in political history. For decades, the American colonies had been notorious for their inability to work together. They had different economies, different religions, different social systems, and different relationships with Britain. Virginia planters had little in common with Massachusetts merchants. Pennsylvania Quakers viewed South Carolina slave owners with suspicion. New York fur traders operated in a different world from Georgia rice farmers. These differences had repeatedly prevented colonial cooperation. During the French and Indian War, Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union had failed because colonies refused to surrender any authority to a central body. Trade disputes, boundary conflicts, and religious differences had kept the colonies divided and suspicious of each other. British officials had long counted on this disunity as one of their greatest advantages in managing the American empire. The Intolerable Acts changed everything. Suddenly, colonists from Georgia to New Hampshire saw their own future in Massachusetts' present. If Britain could revoke one colony's charter, they could revoke any colony's charter. If British soldiers could be quartered in Boston homes, they could be quartered anywhere. If Massachusetts could be starved into submission through economic warfare, no colony was safe. The response was immediate and unprecedented. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses declared a day of fasting and prayer for their sister colony of Massachusetts. George Washington, who had little personal connection to New England, wrote that the cause of Boston now is and ever will be considered as the cause of America. In South Carolina, planters who had never seen snow sent rice and money to help Boston through its ordeal. But the most powerful response came from ordinary people throughout the colonies. In small towns and rural counties from New Hampshire to Georgia, citizens gathered to pass resolutions condemning the Intolerable Acts and pledging support for Massachusetts. These weren't organized by colonial governments or political leaders. They were spontaneous expressions of popular outrage at British tyranny. The Suffolk Resolves, passed by Massachusetts counties in September 1774, became the template for resistance throughout America. These resolutions declared the Intolerable Acts unconstitutional, urged Massachusetts to form its own government, and called for economic warfare against Britain through boycotts and non-importation agreements. When the Continental Congress endorsed the Suffolk Resolves, they were essentially endorsing revolution. The boycott movement that emerged in response to the Intolerable Acts was unlike anything seen before in the colonies. Previous boycotts had been partial, temporary, and largely confined to merchants and the wealthy. This new boycott was comprehensive, permanent, and embraced by all social classes. Farmers refused to sell grain to British ships. Artisans stopped buying British tools. Even children gave up tea and sugar to support the cause. Women played a crucial role in this resistance movement. They organized spinning bees to produce homespun cloth, held tea parties where they drank Liberty tea, made from local herbs, and enforced the boycott in their communities. The Daughters of Liberty became as important to the resistance as the Sons of Liberty, transforming domestic life into political action. The economic impact on Britain was severe and immediate. British merchants who had opposed the Stamp Act and other earlier measures now found themselves facing economic ruin as American orders dried up. They flooded Parliament with petitions demanding repeal of the Intolerable Acts, but it was too late. The momentum toward confrontation had become unstoppable. Perhaps most importantly, the Intolerable Acts created a new American identity that transcended colonial boundaries. For the first time, people began to think of themselves as Americans first and colonists second. The shared experience of resisting British tyranny created bonds that previous economic or social connections had failed to establish. The Continental Congress itself was proof of this transformation. Delegates who had arrived in Philadelphia as representatives of separate colonies found themselves debating as Americans. They discovered that their common commitment to liberty was stronger than their regional differences. John Adams, initially suspicious of Southern delegates, wrote to his wife Abigail that he was amazed by the spirit of liberty he found among representatives from all colonies. The military preparations that began in response to the Intolerable Acts also revealed this new unity. When Massachusetts began training militia companies, other colonies followed suit. When Massachusetts asked for military supplies, they arrived from unexpected sources. The weapons and gunpowder that would be used at Lexington and Concord came not just from Massachusetts, but from a dozen colonies that had decided their destinies were linked. The irony was perfect and complete. Britain had passed the Intolerable Acts to demonstrate the futility of resistance, to show that imperial power could crush any challenge to royal authority. Instead, they had demonstrated that resistance was not only possible, but necessary. They had intended to isolate Massachusetts and terrify other colonies into submission. Instead, they had created a continental alliance dedicated to resistance. King George Roman III and his ministers had fundamentally misunderstood the American character. They assumed that colonists, like other imperial subjects, would submit when faced with overwhelming force. They failed to grasp that Americans had been shaped by 150 years of frontier life, self-governance, and religious freedom. These were not people who submitted easily to tyranny, especially when that tyranny threatened everything they valued most. As 1774 drew to a close, the transformation was complete. Britain's harshest punishment had become America's greatest gift, the gift of unity forged in the fire of shared suffering and common cause. The Intolerable Acts had done what no amount of persuasion, compromise, or gradual evolution could have accomplished. They had created a nation. The delegates who gathered in Philadelphia that September had arrived as representatives of separate colonies. They would leave as founding fathers of a united America, bound together by their common commitment to liberty and their shared determination to resist tyranny wherever it might arise. Britain had sought to divide and conquer. Instead, they had united and inspired the birth of a new nation. And there you have it, the 4 laws that changed everything: the Boston Port Act that turned economic warfare into colonial unity, the Massachusetts Government Act that killed democracy in 1 colony and accidentally birthed it in 13, the Administration of Justice Act that made British officials immune from colonial law and colonial justice, and the Quartering Act that violated the most sacred principle of English liberty, that a man's home is his castle. But here's the most incredible part of this story. Britain had every advantage. They had the world's most powerful navy, best-trained army, unlimited resources, and absolute legal authority over the colonies. The colonists had none of these things. What they had was something far more powerful, the unshakable belief that free people should govern themselves. The Intolerable Acts teach us that liberty isn't guaranteed by documents or governments. It's guaranteed by people who refuse to accept tyranny, no matter how powerful the tyrant. When ordinary farmers, merchants, and tradesmen in Massachusetts decided they'd rather shut down their own courts than accept perverted justice, they were making the same choice our founders would make at Lexington and Concord. Today, as we face our own challenges to liberty and self-governance, the lesson of 1774 remains crystal clear. Unity in the face of tyranny is not just our right, it's our responsibility. The moment we stop defending freedom for others is the moment we begin to lose it for ourselves. What do you think? Are there parallels between the Intolerable Acts and challenges to liberty we face today? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one and love hearing your perspectives. If this story of freedom's triumph over tyranny inspired you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories of liberty. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the moments that shaped human freedom. And remember, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. Our ancestors in 1774 paid that price, and now it's our turn. Until next time, keep fighting for freedom.